On the morning of July 7, 1944, the largest Banzai attack in the history of the Pacific War erupted on the island of Saipan. Over 4,000 Japanese soldiers, wounded men, support troops, and even civilians surged forward in a massive suicidal charge against American positions. What followed was a catastrophic battle that would leave more than 900 out of 1,100 US frontline troops dead or seriously wounded, a loss rate of 83%. Nearly every Japanese attacker died in the assault. This is the story of that desperate final stand. By early July 1944, the US Army's 27th Infantry Division, alongside Marine units, had been battling Japanese defenders on Saipan since the invasion began on June 15th. The island, part of the Mariana Islands chain, was critical to American strategic objectives. Its capture would bring long-range B-29 bombers within striking distance of the Japanese home islands, fundamentally altering the Pacific War's trajectory. The 27th Infantry Division, a New York National Guard unit federalized before the war, consisted of 3 infantry regiments, the 105th, 106th, and 165th. These were supported by the 104th and 105th Field Artillery Battalions, the 102nd Engineer Battalion, and the 102nd Medical Battalion. The division had already seen action in the Gilbert Islands, but Saipan would prove to be its most brutal test. Opposing them were approximately 30,000 Japanese defenders under Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, commander of the Northern Mariana Islands Army Group. His forces included the 43rd Division, elements of the 31st Army, and various naval infantry and construction units. By late June, these troops had been pushed steadily northward by the relentless American advance, compressed into an ever-shrinking pocket in Saipan's rugged northern terrain. The geography of northern Saipan favored defense. Steep ridges, deep ravines, and dense vegetation created natural fortifications. American troops had given these blood-soaked features grimly descriptive names: Purple Heart Ridge, Death Valley, Paradise Valley. Each yard gained cost lives. Each ridge taken revealed another behind it. By July 6th, the Japanese situation had become desperate. Cut off from reinforcement, isolated from any hope of resupply, and facing an enemy with overwhelming superiority in firepower, air support, and naval gunfire, General Saito recognized that defeat was inevitable. Japanese military doctrine, however, did not permit surrender. The concept of jokusai, honorable extinction, demanded that troops fight to the death rather than accept the shame of capitulation. The 27th Division's frontline positions on the night of July 6th stretched across the Tanapag Plain in northern Saipan. The 105th Infantry Regiment held the left flank, positioned near the island's western coast. The regiment's 1st and 2nd Battalions occupied the forward positions, with the 3rd Battalion in reserve. To their right were elements of the 106th Regiment, and further right the Marines held the eastern sectors. The 105th's positions were thinly held. Approximately 1,100 men occupied a front of several thousand yards. Some positions consisted of little more than shallow foxholes and hasty defensive works. Artillery support was provided by the 105th Field Artillery Battalion with their 105mm howitzers positioned to the rear, capable of delivering devastating firepower, but vulnerable if the front line collapsed. Behind the American lines, support elements maintained the division's combat capability. Aid stations treated the steady stream of wounded. Supply units moved ammunition and rations forward. Engineers prepared defensive positions. None of these rear echelon troops expected to be thrust into direct combat. They were wrong. In a depression known to Americans as Paradise Valley, and to the Japanese as the Valley of Death, thousands of Japanese troops gathered on the evening of July 6th. These were not fresh elite soldiers, but the exhausted survivors of weeks of brutal combat. Among them were walking wounded with bandaged heads and limbs, headquarters clerks who had never fired their rifles in anger, sailors from destroyed ships, construction troops, and even some civilians who had attached themselves to military units. General Saito had already decided his course of action. On July 6th, he issued his final order. Whether we attack or whether we stay where we are, there is only death. However, in death there is life. We must utilize this opportunity to exalt true Japanese manhood. I will advance with those who remain to deliver another blow to the American devils and leave my bones on Saipan as a bulwark of the Pacific. This was not rhetoric. It was a death sentence, willingly embraced. Japanese officers distributed the last rations, canned goods, rice, and remarkably beer and sake. Soldiers consumed alcohol not for courage, but as a ritualized farewell, a final taste of life before the charge. Some wrote last letters knowing they would never be delivered. Others sharpened bayonets or checked their few remaining rounds of ammunition. Many had no bullets at all and armed themselves with bamboo spears, sharpened sticks, or nothing but their bare hands. Lieutenant General Saito himself would not lead the charge. Following samurai tradition, he and Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the commander who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor and who now found himself trapped on Saipan, committed ritual sacrifice on the night of July 6th. Their deaths released their subordinates from the obligation to await further orders. The attack was now inevitable. Command of the final assault fell to Colonel Takuji Suzuki and other surviving officers. These men knew exactly what they were ordering: the complete annihilation of everyone under their command. There would be no retreat, no withdrawal, no second chance. This was Gyokusai in its purest form. The attack was to commence in the pre-dawn darkness, the Japanese commanders reasoning that confusion and surprise would multiply their effectiveness. Officers synchronized watches, those who still had them. Sword-wielding junior officers would lead their men forward, maintaining the samurai tradition of the officer at the front. The password would be simple: 7 lives for the Emperor, referring to the belief that one should be willing to die and be reborn 7 times in service to the nation. As midnight passed and the early hours of July 7th approached, more than 4,000 Japanese troops assembled. They formed not in neat ranks, but in rough groups, units mixed together, wounded supporting each other, sailors beside soldiers, civilians clutching weapons they barely knew how to use. It was not an army. It was a mob united by a single purpose: to die attacking the enemy. At approximately 4:45 a.m. on July 7th, 1944, the Banzai charge erupted from the darkness. The first indication that something was wrong came from American sentries who heard movement and strange sounds from the Japanese positions. Before they could react, thousands of screaming Japanese soldiers burst from the pre-dawn gloom, advancing in waves across the Tanapag Plain directly toward the 105th Infantry Regiment's positions. Banzai! Banzai! The war cry echoed across the battlefield, mixed with shouts of 7 lives for the Emperor. Officers led from the front, brandishing swords and pistols, silhouetted against the lightening sky. Behind them came the masses, soldiers with rifles and bayonets, wounded men hobbling forward on crutches, unarmed troops wielding clubs and stones, all driven by the same suicidal determination. The initial American response was immediate but inadequate. Riflemen opened fire into the mass of attackers. Machine guns chattered, cutting down the first ranks. Artillery observers called for fire missions, and within minutes 105mm shells began exploding among the Japanese. But there were too many targets and too few defenders. The sheer weight of numbers overwhelmed the 105th's forward positions. The 1st Battalion, holding the extreme left flank near the coast, took the brunt of the assault. Foxholes that had seemed adequate for defense against conventional attacks were simply overrun by hundreds of Japanese troops. Individual fights became desperate hand-to-hand struggles. Bayonets clashed, grenades exploded, men grappled in the darkness, killing with rifle butts, trench knives, and bare hands. Private First Class Guy Gabolden, a Marine interpreter attached to the 27th Division and positioned nearby, later described the sound. It was like nothing I'd ever heard. Thousands of voices screaming at once. You couldn't hear individual words, just this wave of noise coming at you with the bodies behind it. The Japanese charge penetrated deep into American positions. Some units were completely overrun, their defenders killed or scattered. Communication lines were cut. Command and control disintegrated. In the chaos, American artillery fire fell dangerously close to friendly positions as forward observers were killed or forced to flee. Lieutenant Colonel William J. O'Brien, commanding the 1st Battalion, 105th Infantry, rallied his remaining men. As Japanese troops broke through his lines, O'Brien personally led counterattacks with whatever forces he could scrape together. He organized defensive positions, directed fire, and moved constantly along the line to shore up weak points. When his command post was threatened, he grabbed a rifle and fought alongside his men, but the Japanese kept coming. Second and third waves followed the first, stepping over their own dead, pressing forward with undiminished intensity. American defensive positions that had held for weeks collapsed in minutes. Machine gun crews fired until their barrels glowed red, then were overwhelmed and killed at their weapons. Mortar teams exhausted their ammunition and were forced to fight with pistols and rifles. At approximately 5:30 a.m., with dawn breaking, the full scale of the catastrophe became apparent. The 105th Infantry Regiment's front line had ceased to exist as a coherent defensive position. Hundreds of Japanese troops had penetrated through to rear areas where support units were completely unprepared for combat. The Banzai charge didn't stop at the front line. It rolled through and into the American rear areas, creating chaos among units that had never expected to face direct assault. Aid stations became battlegrounds. Medical personnel, protected under the Geneva Conventions, but facing an enemy that recognized no such niceties, found themselves fighting for their lives. Wounded American soldiers lying on stretchers were bayoneted. Medics armed themselves with rifles, carbines, and pistols scavenged from casualties. One of the most extraordinary acts of heroism occurred at an aid station operated by Captain Ben L. Salomon, a dentist serving as a surgeon with the 105th Infantry Regiment. When Japanese troops began overrunning the position, Salomon ordered the wounded evacuated and grabbed an M1919 Browning machine gun. He positioned himself at the entrance to the aid station and opened fire, allowing the wounded to escape. Witnesses later reported that Salomon manned the machine gun alone, holding off wave after wave of Japanese attackers. When his position was finally overrun and American forces retook the area hours later, they found Salomon dead, slumped over the machine gun. His body showed 76 wounds, bullet and bayonet injuries, indicating he had fought to his last breath. Around his position lay 98 dead Japanese soldiers, testament to his desperate last stand. Salomon would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, though not until 2002 due to complications regarding medical personnel engaging in combat. Across the rear areas, supply clerks, cooks, drivers, and engineers grabbed whatever weapons they could find and formed improvised defensive lines. A cook sergeant armed himself with a Browning automatic rifle and killed 11 Japanese soldiers before being wounded. A chaplain, forbidden from carrying weapons, dragged wounded men to safety under fire and administered last rites to the dying even as Japanese troops closed in. The 105th Field Artillery Battalion, positioned approximately a mile behind the front line, suddenly found enemy troops among their gun positions. Artillery pieces designed to fire at ranges of several miles were now engaging targets at 50 yards. Crews loaded their 105mm howitzers with fuse-quick high-explosive shells and fired directly into masses of Japanese troops at point-blank range. The effect was devastating, but the Japanese kept coming. Lieutenant Colonel O'Brien, still directing the defense near the front, was wounded multiple times but refused evacuation. At approximately 7 a.m., his position was finally overrun. Witnesses reported seeing O'Brien, armed only with a pistol and severely wounded, shooting Japanese soldiers at close range before being killed. He would receive a posthumous Medal of Honor. The fighting devolved into a series of isolated engagements across a chaotic battlefield. Small groups of Americans held out in pockets, surrounded by Japanese troops, fighting until they ran out of ammunition or were killed. Some positions changed hands multiple times. A ridge would be taken by the Japanese, retaken by American counterattack, then lost again as another wave of attackers surged forward. By 8 a.m., the situation had stabilized somewhat, not because the Japanese attack had been repelled, but because the attackers were running out of men. The waves of charging soldiers became thinner. The shouts of Banzai grew less frequent. The Japanese assault was burning itself out through sheer attrition. American reinforcements arrived throughout the morning of July 7th. The 106th Infantry Regiment shifted units to shore up the 105th's shattered positions. Marine units on the right flank wheeled left to enfilade Japanese troops still pressing forward. Tank destroyers and Sherman tanks moved up, their cannon and machine guns cutting down Japanese soldiers who had no anti-tank weapons. Naval gunfire, called in by surviving forward observers, began systematically pounding areas where Japanese troops were concentrating. Battleships and cruisers offshore fired salvo after salvo into the Valley of Death and other assembly areas, killing hundreds of Japanese troops attempting to reinforce the attack. American fighter bombers from escort carriers offshore joined the battle, strafing and bombing Japanese positions with impunity. With complete air superiority, the pilots could make repeated attack runs without fear of interception. Napalm canisters tumbled from wings, spreading walls of flame across Japanese positions. 500-pound bombs exploded among troops caught in the open. The Japanese attack had shot its bolt. By mid-morning, organized resistance had collapsed into isolated pockets of holdouts fighting to the death. American troops, many of them exhausted and wounded themselves, methodically cleared Japanese soldiers from captured positions. Foxholes that had been American, then Japanese, became American again. The cost became apparent as casualty collection points filled with dead and wounded. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment had effectively ceased to exist as fighting units. Of approximately 1,100 men in the 2 battalions at the start of the attack, more than 900 had been killed or seriously wounded. Some companies had been reduced to fewer than a dozen men. The regimental commander later described his battalions as destroyed. The Japanese suffered even more catastrophically. American burial details counted over 4,000 dead Japanese soldiers in the area of the attack. This figure didn't include those killed by artillery and naval gunfire in rear areas, or those who died of wounds in the following days. The Banzai charge had achieved exactly what its planners intended, the complete annihilation of the attacking force. But the charge had also failed in its objective. The American lines had bent, but not broken. The 27th Division, though bloodied, still held its positions. The Japanese had no reserves, no follow-on forces, no ability to exploit whatever limited gains the attack had achieved. By sacrificing thousands of men in a single desperate assault, the Japanese command had ensured that organized resistance on Saipan would end not with a fight, but with a whimper. By the afternoon of July 7th, American forces had regained control of all overrun positions. Engineers bulldozed trenches and buried Japanese dead in mass graves. The 27th Infantry Division pulled the 105th Regiment's remnants out of the line. Fresh units took over and began clearing remaining holdouts from Saipan's northern tip. On July 9, 1944, organized Japanese resistance on Saipan officially ended. Mopping up operations would continue for weeks as troops cleared Japanese holdouts from the island's cave system. The cost was staggering. American casualties for the Saipan operation exceeded 16,500, with over 3,400 killed. The 27th Infantry Division alone suffered approximately 6,500 casualties. Japanese losses were catastrophic. Of approximately 30,000 defenders, only about 1,000 survived to be taken prisoner, most of them Korean laborers or civilians. Nearly 29,000 Japanese troops died, with thousands more civilians perishing in the battle or choosing suicide rather than capture. The final days witnessed one of the war's greatest tragedies as hundreds of Japanese civilians leapt to their deaths from cliffs at the island's northern tip. This location, later named Banzai Cliff and Suicide Cliff, became a grim monument to the Pacific War's human cost. The Banzai charge on Saipan was the largest of its kind in the Pacific War. Similar attacks occurred on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Each followed the same pattern. Japanese forces, facing inevitable defeat, launched frontal assaults rather than surrender. These attacks reflected the revived samurai code of Bushido. Surrender was portrayed not merely as military defeat, but as personal and national disgrace. This doctrine meant that Pacific Island battles could not end with negotiated surrenders. Every island had to be taken yard by yard, cave by cave, with defenders fighting literally to the last man. Today, Saipan's northern region contains numerous memorials to both American and Japanese dead. The American Memorial Park in Garapan includes a memorial listing the names of the dead, a museum documenting the battle, and grounds for reflection. Japanese memorials dot the island, particularly near Banzai Cliff and Suicide Cliff, where so many civilians died. The Valley of Death, where Japanese troops assembled before the charge, remains largely unchanged. The terrain is rugged, overgrown with jungle vegetation marked by caves and ravines. Purple Heart Ridge and the Tanapag Plain, where the 105th Infantry Regiment made its stand, are similarly preserved. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe and share.